Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you to the Palestine Center. I'm honored to be the first speaker at your annual conference. So Yusuf asked me to speak a little bit about the revolutions in the Arab world. Where did it come from? Where is it going? And I'm also going to add a couple of thoughts on what does it mean for Palestine. And I'm going to have to add a couple of thoughts about Egypt, because those of you who know me know I can never get through a talk without saying something about Egypt. So, okay, where did all this change come from? Look, from my point of view, there have been tectonic shifts in Arab societies. And this is, to me, quite noticeable over the last at least over the last 5-7 years, and you know, we can go back and look at the roots of it, but there are certainly, perhaps due to the changes in the information environment, rising awareness in Arab societies of what was going on inside their own countries, and what was going and also what was going on within the region and within the world, and so forth. Greater calls for transparency, awareness of issues like corruption, issues like torture and other human rights abuses. A lifting of taboos on subjects, an opening up of dialogue and hearing different perspectives on a lot of subjects. A general sense in which people were losing the fear of their governments. It's not completely gone, but it's becoming significantly less over time. And rising expectations of what people wanted from their governments, how they wanted to be treated by their governments, dissatisfaction with government performance. These are all were things that were generally, you know, observable in the Arab countries over the last, at least over the last 5-7 years, and one can trace it back even further than that, but it was sort of growing. And so what I saw happening was a growing gap between societies and governments in the Arab countries. And obviously this was much sharper in some countries than others, and that this gap over the last few years in certain places, and Egypt was certainly one of those, was becoming a yawning gulf. Now, I think you're giving me a little bit too much credit to say I predicted the revolution in Egypt. I wish it's true that I had, but what I did see coming was trouble of some kind, because of this growing gulf. That governments, and the Egyptian government was a good example of this, were making very minimal adjustments to these changes in their societies. And very minimal reforms and things like that, cosmetic reforms, and even taking half measures and then rolling those back again halfway, and so forth. And so there was definitely a situation of a rising temperature and a growing protest movements in a number of Arab countries, Egypt among them. So, okay, that's sort of where I see this coming from, and then we all know what happened and how things sort of suddenly burst forth. Where's it going? To me, what this is all about is a redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the state, right? And we've heard this rallying cry of dignity and justice, social justice, and so forth. And these are about the relationship between the citizens and the state, that people want to be citizens in their country with a voice in how they're ruled, and also with a voice in things like how the economic goods in the society are dealt out. And they don't want to be merely subjects of a government that treats them however it would like to treat them, and not very well in most cases. This is a long process, I think, this redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the state. I think it's a process that's going to take years at best. Certainly, if you look at other countries around the world that have gone through transitions from authoritarian rule to democratic rule of some kind, it's a process that takes years. It's not something to be measured in months. It's something that takes years, and in some cases even decades. And there will be slipping back, and there will be problems and dislocations, possibly violence, economic crises. All of these things are unfortunately to be expected. Now, in my humble opinion, however, these are it's extremely important that the Arab countries do make this journey, and that citizens are able to renegotiate their relationship with the government in ways that are satisfactory to them, and that we in the United States and elsewhere need to be serious about doing whatever we can to help this process along. But also sticking with it and not giving up and saying, oh, well, we knew they couldn't do it, the first time a problem comes along, because problems certainly will come along. We're already seeing them now. There are some very important mega issues to be worked out, I think, in these transitions. There are, among the political issues, I think, are the relations between Islamists and non-Islamists within the society, and whether they can cooperate to work out rules of political system, the rule of law, and so forth, rules under which there can be free political competition, but at the same time in which everyone's rights are protected by a system. Including the rights of women, including the rights of non-Muslims, and so forth in these societies. So that's one of the critical issues. I mean, certainly in the three countries that are in active transitions now, in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, that's a very important issue in each of those countries. It looks a little bit different in each country, but it's going to be one of the critical political issues. The relationship between military and civilian, and the hashing out of those is going to be extremely important. I mean, we're seeing this most obviously right now in Egypt. Maybe some of you read the Washington Post editorial this morning, which I thought nailed it, about the very real danger at this point that the military in Egypt will try to negotiate for itself in this transition period, not only a continuation of the sort of political role they had under Mubarak, but actually an enhancement, making the de facto authority they had de jure in the new constitution, and even expanding it, so that we could, we could see emerging in Egypt what I would think looks like Pakistan on the Nile, of where you would have, elected civilian institutions, but without much power, and a military security apparatus behind the scenes, unelected, that is in effect over the civilian authorities. That's a very troubling scenario, I think, something we should be concerned about right now. The other one I would say is economic issues. I've spent actually most of my time since these revolutions started looking at economic issues, because I've been just seized by how important that's going to be. It's very typical around the world that countries that go through political transitions have economic dislocations, and that the economic dislocations and people's disappointment with the fact that their economic condition doesn't improve, or it could even deteriorate quite a bit during a political transition. This can undermine and bring down the political transitions. So I think the economic conditions are going to be important. And one of the challenges here is that certainly in both Tunisia and Egypt, we saw a rejection of the kind of crony capitalism policies that were pursued under Ben Ali and Mubarak. And But I think that we're still at a point in those countries where people have a better sense of what they don't want than what they do want from their economy. I was just in Egypt a couple of weeks ago, and people talk about, well, we want a market economy with social justice. And that's fine, but that's a slogan at this point. It doesn't tell you. There are 100 different permutations of what that might mean in terms of an actual economic and political system. And these things very much need to be fleshed out. It doesn't seem urgent in the face of the political and security challenges, but I think it is urgent because otherwise, if governments, transitional governments and newly elected governments pursue very misguided economic policies, we can see serious economic crises developing that then, as I said, bring the political transition tumbling down. All right. A couple of thoughts on what this means for Palestine. So, as we all know, these revolutions were primarily focused, people were focused on their own governments, issues outside their borders, whether it's the Palestine issue or U.S. foreign policy or any other issue were not a major factor in these revolutions. And people, I think, in the countries that have undergone change, and even in other countries as well, remain very focused on their domestic issues. However, there is definitely a mood in the region of accountability, as I said. And I think that some of the policies that Israel has pursued and the United States as well, where we try to play by a different set of rules, are not going to be acceptable, and that we're going to see publics in Arab countries protesting more strongly against those kind of policies, and that in many countries, and especially those that have undergone transition, that public opinion is going to count in their foreign policies a lot more than it has counted. We saw an early example of this in the border incident between Egypt and Israel, a month or so ago, and the very strong reaction inside of Egypt that actually led to the evacuation of the Israeli embassy in Cairo and the ransacking of the Israeli embassy in Cairo. So this is something that I think we need to be aware of, that as things happen in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, we're going to see much more significant reactions to it. Now, what does this also mean for the for inside of Palestine? I mean, we've seen a few things happen, and I'm sure you'll be talking about that more in the other panels, about things that are happening inside of Palestine, inside of Palestinian politics and society that are sort of part of the Arab Spring phenomenon. But I would also say that, look, this mood of people demanding accountability, demanding results, having this kind of "we're not going to take it anymore" attitude, it was turned against the several Arab governments. Israel, it can be turned against the United States. I think it can also be turned against the Palestinian leadership. And that's something to think about. How is this going to work out inside of Palestine? I think that at the moment, it's really not clear whether the PLO or Hamas are going to be the ones who are going to benefit from the Arab Spring. I could make you, I could give you some arguments on both sides of that. On the one hand, Hamas might be weakened if the Syrian regime is weakened, and we saw Hamas maybe being a bit more flexible in the prisoner Shalit deal than it might have otherwise been, and in the deal, the Palestinian reconciliation deal in May, perhaps because it felt that its base in Damascus was a bit weakened. But then on the other hand, the prisoner deal perhaps now has strengthened Hamas. And so it's not really clear to me at this point. I think that both the Palestinian leadership and Hamas are trying to benefit in different ways from what's going on in the Arab Spring and from this this sentiment in the Arab world demanding results, demanding accountability, but it's not clear to me how this is going to work out. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
I want to continue in the same sort of trajectory that Michelle laid out by talking a little bit about, of course, it's, we've come to the point where we've memorialized and iconized the revolutions. We've celebrated them, we've been jubilant, we've rejoiced, and so have the many communities in the Arab world that have both participated and observed them. And I think it's time for us to take a step back and really try to come to grips with a meaningful articulation of where the revolutions have come, look at what we've harvested thus far and what it is that we can look forward to in the coming period. I'm going to sort of be, act as the damper here by saying that I think the revolutions, while I'm incredibly supportive of what they've accomplished thus far, I believe are experiencing a serious rough patch. That they've hit a very serious frictional moment, and one that, to a great extent, threatens their ability to produce tangible and long-term change in each of their respective societies. And I think part of that, excuse me, part of that is a result of what I've described as a preemptive jubilation. You take the case of Egypt that Michelle was able to describe very succinctly, and on February 11th, when Mubarak stepped down, there was a huge celebration, and the protesters departed from Tahrir Square with the intent to shift strategies to nation building and active participation and a discussion surrounding good governance and things of the sort. The transition itself was not particularly clear, and there was the assumption that the revolution was in good hands, because we had a fairly well-meaning military council that had there was no reason to believe that they would do anything to undermine what had been accomplished by millions of Egyptians who had streamed into the streets over the period of 18 days. Unfortunately, what we're witnessing, not just in Egypt, but across the region to varying degrees, is sort of the re-articulation and the reimagining of authoritarianism. It's a new kind of authoritarianism rather than the one we'd grown accustomed to, one that looks very much like tyranny and dictatorship, and something that you can abhor easily, to something far more complicated and far more nuanced. And so I'm going to call it hegemony. The Arab regimes are learning to be more and more hegemonic, to come up with different strategies that allow them to continue to hold their positions in power and change their faces and change their approaches. Nothing is more nothing parodies this, but is in a very sort of sad and sadistic way, than watching National Democratic Party candidates in Egypt run for the upcoming parliamentary election with a new sort of identity. I mean, now they're playing the Islamist note with the attempt of appealing to a public that they believe might be Islamist. So you have candidates who now are wearing the veil or are carrying the Qurans in their election posters and things of that sort. So I want to take a step back and say that the regimes are re-articulating their positions. They've developed a new way of flexibly and malleably and tokenistically bribing the publics into believing that actual change is being realized. And they're resorting to very, very particular strategies. And you will be, as I describe those strategies, regimes and governments and locales will come to mind. But those strategies, for the most part, are meant to dispirit the revolutionaries and the youth movements. The first is the rushing to elections. That elections are a good thing, this is what you've been asking for, so let's go to elections quickly, without having the infrastructure in place, without having the representation necessary to allow for the participation of the major forces that were part and parcel of the revolutionary movement. The other strategy is the complete opposite, which is the slowing to election. And in some cases, we're watching them happen in tandem. The Egyptian situation is quite like that, where the military council does not give a date for an election until just prior. I mean, so the date for the upcoming parliamentary election was not known until about a week and a half ago. And still, we're not really certain if it's going to unfold. They just said, yesterday is the day when candidates are supposed to campaign. The same thing happened when they had the constitutional referendum back in March. The protesters and the revolutionary movements and the youth groups had about 2 weeks to organize and try to mobilize their own counterparts and their constituencies to come out. So this back and forth, this oscillation between very, very fast progress and very slow progress, rushing people into elections when they don't have the capability to move forward, and then slowing them down so as to disparage them in the process. Of course, other countries where revolutions have unfolded or protests or uprisings have unfolded, there's always the threat of civil war. The Libyan example sort of looms large in the case of both Syria and Yemen, as well as Egypt. The fact that anything can happen, the unpredictability of the future is more unfavorable than the stability of the status quo. Also, the fear that there might be sectarianism, and sectarianism has become sort of the flagship criteria to dishearten protesters in various places. So in the case of Syria, of course, the resort to sectarianism as a potential, and of course, in essence, it's a dual strategy of both warning against sectarianism and instilling it simultaneously. So in the case of Syria, we know very well that the protest movement is vacillating between becoming mushrooming and becoming sort of a significant component of the public uprising and being demoralized by the fear of this descending into a sectarian civil war. In the case of Egypt as well, a country where the majority of the protesters, of the protest movement, was comprised of both Muslims and Christians, rich and middle class and poor. I mean, every caste, every constituency within society. The events of a few weeks ago in Maspero, in front of the television building, as a result of a protest of predominantly Christians, but not exclusively, resulted in a confrontation with the military and has fed back into the system the fear of divisions within society. And those divisions, of course, there's a fear that it might descend into sectarianism. So the strategy is one of dividing and conquering, but not just within the ranks of the societies and the citizenry, but also between political parties and political representatives. So take, for instance, what's happened or what has become of the Muslim Brotherhood in the run-up to the elections. Now you've got the splintering of the organization, maybe a healthy thing in the long term, as more sort of a more clear-minded approach to politics emerges within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. But to a large extent, it's happening both within the ranks of the Islamist political representation, as well as the liberal groups, as well as the youth. So this splintering is extremely disadvantageous for progress as far as the revolutions are concerned, especially when one tends to believe that the revolutions have not accomplished the goals and objectives that have been enshrined in them. And another point to disparage the revolutionaries is actually going as far as accusing the protesters or the revolutionaries of derailing progress in the country. And I can say that at the very least in Egypt. Of course, in Tunisia, the memorialization of the revolution has actually helped facilitate the elections, and there's a feeling of general optimism in Tunisia. The complete opposite is happening in Egypt now, where many of those who participated in the early days of the revolution, many of those who called it, including the April 6th youth group, are now behind bars, facing military sentences, some of them hefty, some of them not so hefty, but at least symbolically demoralizing them. And the revolution in many circles in Egyptian society is being accused of having derailed economic progress. So the intent is to ensure that the average Egyptian no longer feels connected to the revolution, that the revolution has destabilized the country economically, has hurt the market, has hurt the tourism industry, and there's no longer any foreign investment as a result of the revolution. So the revolution accomplished close to nothing in the eyes of the general public. Another point of disparagement is the use of, or at least a rhetorical tool used by many of the governments in the region. Of course, this applies to practically every country with the exception of Tunisia. One almost has to set Tunisia aside completely. But the use of foreign policy complications to justify either slow progress or crackdown against protesters. And that has happened across the board, from Yemen to Bahrain, and from Syria to Egypt. And I need not get into the details of this, but I think everybody will be well aware that any perception that there's an American involvement or an American hand or American participation, even if it were in support of social justice and civic engagement and rule of law and good governance in the region, is being treated and responded to with a significant amount of disdain. Largely because most of these regimes, unfortunately, had been supported by the U.S. government for many years. So the the dual Janus-faced approach, or speaking out of two sides of their mouths, as we see here coming out of Washington, has really hurt the protest movements quite significantly. The failure, for instance, as far as the U.S. government stance on or response to the military crackdown against protesters and civilians in Egypt over the last few months, the silence is almost deafening, and there's a genuine concern that the position taken by the U.S. government is not strong enough. But again, so this is one of the strategies being used by the governments in the region. And of course, the U.S. government finds itself in a very, very tight situation. I mean, whether to support these protest movements now, given how complicated and intricate and nuanced the situations have become, or to step aside and let nature take its course. Of course, we know very well that at no point does nature really take its course in any of these processes. Another major point in sort of demoralizing the spirit of the revolutions is the destruction of any form of inspiration. And this is probably the most problematic. We know full well that the reason why arguments like Egypt is not Tunisia, and Syria is not Egypt and Tunisia, and Libya is not Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia, and Bahrain. The reason why these arguments fell on deaf ears was because of the incredible sort of contagiousness of the protest movement, the call for dignity, the call for self-representation, the desire to participate in public life is extremely contagious, irrespective of the form of authoritarianism that exists. And to hurt this inspiration, there's a need to dismantle any example of a success story in the region. So if you were to take one revolution at a time, the Libyan revolution turned civil war / insurrection / armed rebellion cost tens of thousands of lives by most estimates. So and of course has left the country in relative ruin with relative uncertainty in the future. The Syrian protest movement is continuing to be probably the bloodiest yet. The Egyptian situation has resulted in a military takeover and an attempt to overrule and override the revolution's demands. Yemen is Yemen. Ali Abdullah Saleh is back in full force. And Bahrain has been effectively silenced. So what becomes of these revolutions, and what is it that Arab publics across the region can look to as examples of success? I don't mean to be sort of depressing and pessimistic. There is hope, absolutely, and I think the human spirit will rise up, and the will is impossible to sort of undermine entirely. But I think there are a few points that have to be a few things have to be accomplished, and I'm really running out of time, but I'm going to list them very quickly. There needs to be an enshrinement of the rule of law and the support of every process, every procedure, every attempt to enshrine rule of law in the region. There needs to be a full and complete dismantling of the structures of disempowerment. And I mean that both in the symbolic sense and in the literal sense. There needs to be a confirmation of dignity at the center of public life. And arguably, the failure of the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces in Egypt to rally the public in their support has been precisely that point, that everything that they have stood for thus far in the last 8 months does not fall squarely within the confirmation of dignity as part of public life, a respect of civility, the acceptance of the inevitability of the demise of authoritarianism, that there's no turning back. I mean, these are obstacles along the way. They're creating sort of loopholes and creating sort of labyrinthine mazes so that the protest movements and the revolutions can falter and stumble, but authoritarianism cannot come back and cannot continue in the region inevitably and in an infinite fashion. And last but not least, that there needs to be a complete and final end to paternalism. And I mean paternalism both in the patriarchal sense, but also in the institutional sense, even within the protest and revolutionary movements themselves. Nobody has a monopoly on democracy. Democracy is for everyone. So even if we were to apply it to what Michel described as a potentially problematic situation, both for Fatah and for Hamas, that at the end of the day, there needs to be a reimagining of politics in the region, regardless of whether or not you stand in the line of the US and Israel, or if you stand in the position of the populist movements. You have to be able to articulate a non-paternalistic stance towards your adherents, towards your loyalists, towards your supporters. And that, I think, if anything, would be a major accomplishment of the Arab revolutions. Thank you.
I would like to start by asking the panelists this question, tapping into their expertise into the area. I need to hear your gut feelings about the best and worst case scenarios for what's happening in the Arab world.
Best and worst case scenario. Okay, I would say in terms of a best case scenario, and I assume here we're speaking in terms of the whole question of political change and will there be democratic transitions. Okay, there are a lot of other issues we could speak about in terms of best and worst case scenarios. The best case scenario that I think is still realistic is that we see political transitions in a number of Arab countries that unfold over the next decade or so, and that that 10 years from today, we have, let's say, realistically, it would be possible, I think, to have, say, somewhere between 3 or 4 actual democratic systems in the Arab countries. And that in some of the other Arab countries, in some of the monarchies, you see an actual move toward constitutional monarchies, and then you still have authoritarian systems in some of the other Arab countries. So I think the best case scenario that is still feasible and realistic is that 10 years from now, you have a patchwork. You don't have a more or less an entire area, an entire region with authoritarian governments, but that you have some democratic governments and some constitutional monarchies and some authoritarian systems. And this has lots of interesting implications for inter-Arab relations, by the way, and how all these different kinds of political systems would relate to each other. I mean, right now there are some, before these revolutions, say there were some differences in the degree of authoritarianism in Arab countries, but not so many. Anyway, so that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, I would say, is one that Adel sort of hinted at, which is that what we saw happen this year, earlier this year, was just a wave, and that wave ebbs. So we've seen other waves of, calls for political reform and better human rights practices and so forth in the Arab world. The worst case scenario is that, the changes in society that I talked about were just kind of an episode, that people go back home and that the authoritarian structures reassert themselves. And I mean, probably the really worst case scenario is that that we really do see a spiraling of violence, whether it's sectarian violence in some countries like Syria, like Egypt, and maybe regional violence in a country like Libya. That would be a very sad outcome to what we saw happen earlier this year.
I think Michelle covered the point. I can't think of anything worse than what you described, and I can't think of anything better than the scenario that you described. I think just to sort of reaffirm what Michelle said, I think the worst case scenario, since I'm on that trajectory, the worst case scenario is to have a marriage of two strategies becoming more or less generalizable to most regimes in the region, and that is the combination of use of violence and violence not necessarily by those in power, but by counterparts or within the populace. So essentially the arming of civilians, which we're witnessing across the board. I mean, I just came back from Egypt 10 days ago, and I was utterly shocked by how incredibly visible and present heavy arms were, and they're in the hands of civilians. I mean, I was asked if I wanted to buy a machine gun by a shopkeeper. So this is a very, very interesting and very compelling and very problematic turn of events. So it's the marriage of this form of violence, or the potential of descending into violent conflict between members of the citizenry and the militarization of society, and the creation of a far more convincing and viable illusion of democratic change. The Mubarak government had tried for the last 10 years or so, or at least since 2005, to create the theatrical, performative illusion of democratic change. Parties competing against one another within some semblance of electoral, procedure, and everybody participated in it. Well, not everybody. There was significant boycott and very low voter participation, but for the most part, the political parties that existed on the scene played the game, including the Muslim Brotherhood, which was formally banned. My concern is that this process will become more adapted, more malleable, and more perfected by the regimes. And we're starting to see signs of that, at least as far as the military in Egypt. And I imagine that Egypt will be imitated by many other regimes across the region. So if there is that patchwork, if there is any patchwork, but the worst case scenario is the marriage between the two, and then of course a gradient between those. The best case scenario is incremental change, and of course, as Michelle described, this is an issue of great longevity. We cannot judge these revolutions by what they have or have not accomplished in a few months, but I imagine that there will be at least one example of a democratic state in the region in the next 5 to 10 years, and it's one that might inspire the protest movements elsewhere. But the fear is that the demoralization of the general public across the region may prevent that from happening. But the best case scenario is sort of the lattice work, the mosaic of somewhat revolutionary democracies, and sort of the end of the highly militarized post-colonial revolutionary nationalist agendas that have failed everyone. Both they failed their own agendas and ideologies and failed their own publics. So I think to a large extent it is, these regimes are kind of a dying breed. Their ability to reinvent themselves will determine how far these revolutions will go.
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit disappointed that you didn't go into the issue of press freedom in the area, which is very, very important. And as you well know, the people in the Arabs in the Arab world look to Al Jazeera or this international or regional media for their opinion. How do we go about getting press freedom in the Arab world other than law? Is making the press free. One thing you learn in journalism, 2/3 of your columns have to be advertising, 1/3 media. And look what has happened to the Washington Post in Washington, shrinking every day, and you're not getting enough coverage. So I have a suggestion there. Foreign investment, Western businesses doing business in the Middle East should be encouraged and told or whispered to advertise in the local media so that people can express their opinion freely. Thank you.
Of course, the topic of media is very dear to my heart, and my instinct is to discuss this more so than anything else. But I'm very well aware that there's a panel that will specifically address this, and I think bringing this question to someone like Abdurrahim Fukhara, who I believe will be speaking a little bit later today, would matter more, because I think it's interesting to hear folks at Al Jazeera discuss the context of the reformation of the media and how it's necessary and how it's happened. Of course, the media situation in the Arab world is both extremely encouraging and very discouraging simultaneously. You've got satellite television networks that adopted or embraced some revolutions at the expense of others. In some cases, bankrolled broadcasters in support of some revolutions, but not others. And of course, the landscape is becoming far clearer. The time when we believed or became convinced that the satellite broadcasters, the transnational networks, are freewheeling networks that are not beholden to their owners or sort of the political economic ownership structure, is sort of dying out. I mean, we've awakened, and I think one of the great things about these revolutions is the fact that everybody has been forced to lay down their cards. So everything is quite in the open now. So Al Jazeera has done a remarkable job covering the Egyptian revolution. They've probably gone a tad too far in the manner in which they've covered Syria. And Bahrain is practically non-existent. They've aired one show on Al Jazeera English called "Shouting in the Dark," and then it was banned from rebroadcast. So we're talking about the return of again a reformed, seemingly forward-looking Ministry of Information style broadcasting, only with significant amounts of sensationalism. I would argue that the greatest hope for the region as far as broadcasting is concerned, and this is not because I'm an Egyptian, is the private broadcasting realm in Egypt now. Because the incredible sort of burgeoning space for independent television, satellite television in Egypt, to a large extent is compensating for the absence and the inability of many other networks in the region to do what they need to do to cover various stories. And the battle is actually unfolding as we speak. So the crackdown against media in Egypt, independent and free media in Egypt, is continuing. The Supreme Council for the Armed Forces just appointed a few weeks ago a military censor. Somebody who watches over things, and of course every producer is getting calls: do this, don't do that, cover this, don't cover that, and it seems as though the independent journalists in Egypt have decided to take a collective stance against the regime, and in doing so, undermining the state broadcaster. There are also new and extremely creative and innovative ways to develop sort of these side strategies to circumvent and defeat government control of media. So for a long time there was a discussion, well, why isn't there a public broadcaster anywhere in the Arab world? I mean, if we're trapped between these two models of private broadcasting, which is beholden to the owners and the corporations and the companies and the multinationals, and on the other hand, you've got government broadcasting, which is highly propagandistic. What's the middle ground? The middle ground is public broadcasting. And right now, there's an extremely interesting initiative on the part of many journalists in Egypt to design the first public broadcaster in Egypt and potentially in the Arab world. And this is with small contributions from ordinary citizens. You want a citizens' media? Contribute to it, and we'll develop it ourselves. So if that happens, then we have an interesting breakthrough that could only happen as a result of the revolutions. But up until that point, again, the fluctuations of up and down.
It seems that the United States has always viewed Egypt as a prism, the Egyptian policy toward Israel as a prism for our policy. The Egyptian military has said it's not going to denounce the peace treaty. The Egyptian military gets a lot of money every year from the United States government. There seems to be, I think, a trend developing, I'd like Michelle to comment on this, of the United States actually supporting a military takeover in Egypt, if at least not in law, in fact, that this is what is going to happen because it's in our interest to keep the peace treaty, to keep the Egyptian military on our side. It's in the interest of the Egyptian military to keep taking our money and to do what we want them to do.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, this is an issue of great concern to me, and as you might imagine, I spend quite a bit of time talking to people in the administration or on Capitol Hill about this issue. Look, I think that the Obama administration is very confused about how to look at Egypt. They had this comfortable feeling briefly that Adel alluded to, of feeling, okay, the revolutionaries, turned over the keys to the military. The military is going to guide things toward a democratic transition, and then they're going to, step back from power. And in my own conversations with U.S. officials, even quite recently, I'm sort of surprised to the extent to which this narrative is still accepted by American officials. And in fact, if you've seen, I don't know if you've seen the new special coordinator for the Middle East, Ambassador Bill Taylor at the State Department, gave his first briefing yesterday, and he articulated this. So we really do believe the military are eager to hand back power and so forth. So there's starting to be, a bit of an argument going on here in Washington between people in the administration. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. I mean, either they really honestly believe that, and the military is just misunderstood and so forth, or is that kind of a cynical way of playing this along because they really are happy enough to see the military remain in power? I mean, my argument against that is, look at the way the military in Egypt has handled things so far. Even if let's say you don't care about democracy in Egypt and so forth, and all you care about is the country being run decently well, there being stability, and there being stability on the border with Israel. Let's be that cynical, and let's say that's all we care about. Yeah. The way the military has run things for the last 9 months has not been at all inspiring. Even if you just care about Israel, the way they handled that issue with Israel, the border issue, certainly the way they handled it with the Egyptian public, and their failure to kind of show the Egyptian public that they were protecting Egyptian interests in handling this incident in which several Egyptian border guards were killed. That then led to this riot and a storming of the Israeli embassy. I mean, it was a mess the way they handled it. The way they've handled the economy has been very, very bad, and Egypt's sort of teetering on the brink of disaster economically. The way they've handled sectarian incidents has been just disastrous. They're not getting the police back stood up and reformed and so forth. I mean, they're really so it's not like they're making the trains run on time. Okay, this is not one of these situations where you have efficient. You have to weigh efficient military government against messy democracy, because you don't have efficient military government, and I'm convinced you won't have it. So that's an illusion that I think. Now, my argument with U.S. officials now is that they tend to take this attitude of, oh, well, really, what can we do? We speak to the military in Egypt, we tell them this, we tell them that, but our influence is limited and so forth. And, I'm sorry, a $1.3 billion aid package, it's just not credible to say that we don't have influence, I mean, one has to be wise about how you do these things, and, may not be the best thing to cut them off totally and in one sweep. You have to use that leverage wisely, but you do have to use it. And I think now is the time for that.
Hi, I'm Radi. I'm from Tunisia, so I would prefer that we don't put Tunisia aside. I think there's a lot to learn from Tunisia, and I think it's important for the entire region, for Palestine as well. We just had historic elections take place in Tunisia, and as you know, we don't share borders with Israel, so maybe that's why only one member of Congress bothered to go and observe the elections. It was Betty McCollum from Minnesota. The elections were lauded by international observers. I mean, it was quite historic that they were able to take place. They were transparent. Now we have, as you may know, Ennahda won. They're the Islamist party, and that's all we hear about in the press. The EU said that they were going to condition the aid to Tunisia to human rights, to which Ghannouchi replied, you close your eyes to all the abuses during the Ben Ali regime, so we really don't have to get any lessons from you, any lecture on human rights from the EU. But my question is, are we going to be able to go beyond burqas and bikinis and really accept the results from these countries? And just as an aside, I did not vote for Ennahda, for the Islamists, but I think it's really an important question. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up. I think the points you made were terrific. And I think Tunisia's elections for the Constituent Assembly were a huge success. I don't think there's any problem with people accepting the results of the elections. I mean, I don't hear anyone saying that these were not credible elections, or that the fact that Ennahda won, but won a plurality. They didn't win a majority, so they're not completely in control. I think this is actually a very positive development in terms of exactly what I was talking about Islamists and non-Islamists within the society having now to sit down and to work out, the rules of the road moving forward, the writing of a new constitution, the development of a new political system. And Ennahda is particularly well positioned, I think, to do that among Islamist movements in the Arab world, to be able to, have this communication and be able to give and take and compromise and work something out that will work for everyone. I don't want to be, that's not to say Tunisia might not have rough days ahead of it, but it certainly is lighting the way forward. So I think it's extremely positive. And one of the most important things, I think, that distinguishes the Tunisian case from the Egyptian case, there are a lot of things that distinguish the two countries, of course, size and society and lots of things that are very different about them. But the fact that in Tunisia the military really did step back and allow civilians to drive the transition process, and that they had this very open kind of round table type of process with these large, congresses and so forth. I mean, it was a little messy, but messy in a good way, in the sense that I think a lot of voices were heard as the transition was shaped. I think in Egypt and also Libya, the processes look different and much less participatory than the process in Tunisia, looked. But I will say one thing, and I hope this won't make you unhappy. I've been, thinking about Tunisia and Egypt, and as I'm an avid scuba diver, I often think about things in terms of marine life, and I've been thinking that Tunisia's like a dolphin, sort of, nimbly leaping through the waves of this transition and, sort of to the applause of everyone, and that's wonderful.
And
Egypt is a whale, Egypt is a whale, and my fear is that even if Tunisia succeeds, if the whale dives down, if Egypt's transition fails, it's going to take a lot of things down with it.
Right.
Yeah, just picking up on the conversation on Tunisia and Egypt and the differences. I just want to get the panelists' feedback on the idea of postponing Egyptian elections. And I get the sense that this idea has obviously been discussed, but that there's a lot of resistance to it because the assumption is that that would keep SCAF in power, and you would lose the momentum towards a change of regime and power. But I don't see how you could have free and fair elections. I don't see how the electoral process in bringing a parliament forward at this time, given the negotiations that are going on between SCAF and the powerful parties, would actually produce any kinds of transition. So shouldn't the strategy be to stop and call for the institution of a civilian transitional council or transitional civilian technocratic participatory body to lead and frame the transition going forward? So your comments are welcome.
Okay. I think one of the answer to your question is quite a convoluted one, because at the end of the day, there's really no certainty as to when SCAF will leave power. The elections will not herald a civilian government starting January of 2012. By most estimates, the SCAF will remain in power until the next presidential election, which will likely be in March 2013. So SCAF is not leaving anytime soon, which means that these parliamentary elections are happening at a fairly early time period. There's a problem with there's several problems with the parliamentary election. One of them being the architecture of the election itself. The manner in which the procedure is unfolding, the fact that you have seats for political parties and collective and coalitions on one hand and independents on the other. It's a very, very complicated approach that even most of the political parties are starting to navigate now. We also have entire parties that haven't fielded candidates yet, or haven't figured out who their candidates are going to be, and the deadline has already passed to field them. You've got young people who are unaccustomed to the political process, all of a sudden scrambling to enter themselves into this election. So the whole process is extremely questionable on a variety of different levels. The Supreme Council, in an attempt to showcase its support for young people's participation as candidates in this election, have decided to donate their own facilities to help print campaign material for young people. And that, of course, is a rather sort of strange twist of fate. On one level, you're detaining the protesters and activists, and you're asking their own sort of their comrades to join you in the military facility to print out their campaign material, posters, and what have you. So there's really no certainty as to what this election means. There are significant segments of the protest movement that are calling for a continuation of the revolution. And so I think the reason why it's important for SCAF to have the election now is to basically steal the thunder from what appears to be a mushrooming movement again against them. In the same way that the referendum in March earlier this year was able to sort of quiet down the protest movement to some extent, or at least showcase that there is public participation in some electoral process. So I think we're starting to see these shifts happening. The decision at the end of the day is entirely SCAF's decision. Once there's an elected parliament, their powers will be limited by what SCAF is prepared to relinquish. And at this point, it appears as though they're not relinquishing much. And of course, the best example of that is what authorities they've mandated the interim government. The government of Assam Sharaf has had very little to no authority to do anything in this period. So they cannot be judged independently because SCAF has interfered in practically every decision. So the elections are, for all intents and purposes, as far as I'm concerned, practically a farce because they're too early and they will accomplish little to nothing except perhaps sort of slow down what appears to be a speeding train of confrontation against SCAF on the part of many political forces. So they're giving the protesters a choice between two things. You either continue going out into the streets or you prepare for elections. And if you don't prepare for elections, then you don't draft the next constitution. But what happens when you have pre-constitutional drafts that say the military are the only authority that has a veto over all other branches of government, that their budget is entirely decided by the military. It's not transparent. So really, we're in this sort of nebulous space before the election where we're not sure what these elections mean, what the participation will look like, and what authority they'll give them after.
Can I just add one
please.
sentence to that? Look, I think it would have been, certainly would have been desirable to have civilians in control of the transition, and that's what the political forces in Egypt were calling for, and Mohammed al-Baradei has called for it, relentlessly. But unfortunately, the way things have developed, I think what most of the political parties are calling for now is, okay, hold the parliamentary elections, then hold the presidential election within, a couple of months after that. Between the two houses of parliament, it'll be the beginning of March before those elections are over. Pretty much all the political forces have come together around, let's hold a presidential election in April or May, and then start the drafting of a new constitution. And if after a new constitution is passed, it requires new elections, okay, then we'll do that. But the point is that the SCAF has said it will hand over legislative authority once the parliament is elected, but it would continue to hold executive authority until the president is elected. And all the political forces, including the Muslim Brotherhood, which has worked a lot with the SCAF, are so desperate to get the SCAF out of power now that they're like, please, can we just get a president elected as well, so that the SCAF is forced to hand over executive as well as legislative authority.
Please give him a hand. Thank you.